So back in January of this year, I went to the COC's Opera Exchange, which was a discussion panel about Regietheater, or director's theater in opera. And they talked about whether or not the idea of having such a license for the director, non-traditional productions, modern productions, whether or not that was a good thing for opera. So I came away with a lot of questions of my own from that conversation, and I wanted to continue it with a few new faces. So I rounded up a new panel to get the ideas flowing. I've invited artistic directors Alexander Neef, Joel Ivany, and Michael Mori. I've got arts writers Robert Harris, Lydia Perovic, and Wayne Gooding. And I've invited mezzo-soprano Krisztina Szabó to give her idea, to add her idea to the mix and see what we could discuss about the evolution of opera and the power of the director and what the audience has to say about it. So this is the very first Schmopera panel on the topic of Regietheater, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you all for taking the time. The topic is really what you value in a production. It's not whether or not it's good or bad, because this opinion is basically the underlying thing. But so why are opera fans so particularly polarized by contemporary or weird productions or something, you know?
You know, I've been working in opera for 15 years now. I'm still trying to figure that out. And obviously I see it with my public, I see it with myself too. Although I can get equally upset about the music, somehow you get more upset about staging. And maybe one of the answers is that opera is theater. And it's all about the emotional relationship that comes through the music. And what happens to me when I go see something somewhere else, you usually start liking or hating it within the first 5 to 10 minutes. And if you hate it, I know that from my own experience, that production needs to work very hard to bring me back in. I mean, if you like it, I think if you're like okay with it, it's fine. But if you really hate it, or something happens at the beginning that doesn't make sense to you at all, that's pretty much it for the evening. And I think that happens a lot with the audience.
I think part of the problem is that the companies generally are repeating fairly well-known operas with a few ops and then set in there. And what happens is that people go in with certain expectations of what the Magic Flute or Umbello and Masca and all the rest of it are supposed to be like, and then they're confronted with something that is quite different in the staging. And then the problem becomes not that it's different, it's they're unprepared for it and lack of preparation for it. I mean, if someone can I use COC example or local examples? I mean, the recent Don Giovanni. No, it's okay. The recent Don Giovanni, was very hard, I think, for people who thought they knew Don Giovanni. They just needed to be somewhat prepared for it. And so people get polarized, and as Alexander says, I think, once you get turned off by an opera, you're probably not going to go back to it. Or it's going to be very hard to start liking something that you take a dislike to.
And you're probably making a good point, and I don't want to make this a Don Giovanni discussion, but no, it's the most extreme range of reactions we've got for anything we've done in my time here, from people saying it's possibly the worst thing that anybody has ever put on the stage, to other people saying it's the best thing I've ever seen anywhere.
I think it's interesting that we consider that range of reaction as a problem. In the theater, since the 50s or the 60s, those kinds of productions have been the norm. And when we read the reactions of the original productions of these operas, exactly the same range existed. So that range, it seems to me that music has a basis in ritual. And one of the, I would say, problems of opera is that it became incredibly ritualistic. We went to the opera because we knew precisely what you say. Not only did we know what we were going to get, but we had to have what we were going to get. We went there to absorb the beauty that we already knew existed. And so I think, if it can be argumentative, that opera audiences became incredibly lazy, and therefore reacted very strongly to that ritual being denied. And I think many of them are unprepared to engage with a new work. The opera has changed its character, I would say, for the worse in that ritualistic but I mean, maybe for the better, but it certainly was a ritualistic thing. And these productions which engage you, make you think, make you rethink, are very difficult for people because they're completely unused to it.
I think opera audiences are, far more than any other genre, are purists, and because it's a genre that has evolved perhaps the least of any other artistic living genre right now in its content and presentation, you have an overwhelming percentage of purists in the audience, people who connect it as a historical genre, not wanting it to change too much. And so I see that when you change the things that they already know, that's going to be the reaction. You're going to have people who maybe for whom it reinforces something they thought about it, and those who just think, why does this need something that doesn't really connect in any clear way to the original?
But what is that?
What is what?
Like the original. I think that is actually the big problem. What is the audience's point of reference? Because very, very often it is not the original production that
Absolutely.
we don't know anything about. It's something they liked in the past, or maybe their first encounter with the piece that became the reference.
Yeah.
And from the producer's point of view, I think it's impossible to fight that. Like I have come to say, there's no audience. There's 2,000 audiences at the Four Seasons Center every night.
Yeah.
How do I
You want to please present
cater
it
to
please
every
more people than
single individual frame
Yeah.
of reference?
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's things that you do, and it infuriates people, and you don't really understand why. Other things, you kind of take a risk. You think some people might not like that, others will. But like maybe we can talk about purists. And what that actually means, like I think people define that for themselves.
Absolutely. I agree with you that our audiences, more so than ever right now, are made up of many, 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 many different kinds of opinions and backgrounds. But I think what I meant by purists are people who expect what they believe to be traditional, whether that's a Baron-Reiter version of traditional or if it's more of a this was done in this kind of a way so many times in North America that's become an established standard, and it's a variation on that standard that's too far is what they regard as something that isn't good. There's also the purists who are just like, let it be about the singers, don't let it be about anything else. So if a stupid director comes in the way and says it's going to be about this, which is something that isn't in my brain, it's taking away from the impact of just the beautiful voice. Often the people who come and talk to me, who I consider to be purists, are the people who just say the beauty of the voice, the beauty of the orchestra, the beauty of the original acoustic work is what needs to be front and center.
Talk about Alexander again. Speaking for you, if I may, the COC productions, those questionable productions, may be questionable in terms of the staging. It seems to me that someone has gone to a lot of trouble to make sure they are not questionable musically. And so many people I have heard about your production say, well, I didn't understand that, I hated that, and I don't know why they did it, but it sounded great, the singing was beautiful. So, it's a trick, and in fact, it seems to me that Regietheater in a way is it's a trick that allows us to modernize opera without actually going full force, and as you say, actually creating new opera, which is, very, very difficult, obviously, to do. So it allows us to be somewhat modern and use modern techniques of staging and modern techniques of thinking about the world, but still within a libretto and a score which is known.
I think that even the most outrageous forward-thinking directors are actually very concerned about the text of the opera, the musical text of the opera. When you talk to David Alden, or they want to do the Handel uncut. They don't want to do what was pretty standard practice for the entire 19th century and most of the 20th century, to just, cut and paste to make it fit. So there's definitely a big contradiction there. Like when you talk about being faithful to the work, to the musical text of the work, I would claim that a lot of those productions are way more faithful than what would have been done 50 or 100 years ago. All the cuts in the Verdi operas that were instituted for the 20th century. Now it's almost revolutionary to do an uncut Traviata, and it's not a long piece.
Regie, the term regie, it's just, it doesn't have any usage outside of the North American media, I'm noticing. I mean, it's a boogeyman that just exists in Canada and the US. I think it's dead even in the UK media. I follow French and Belgian media. Nobody uses that distinction anymore. The question critics and audiences are, well, critics, I don't know about the audience, that needs to be studied, but they ask is this working as a piece of theater? If you look, for instance, at what Graham Vick is doing in Birmingham, he's en masse engaging the audience. He did Kovanshchina recently, in which the piece was basically about right-wing populism both in the UK and Russia. And he engaged audiences that moved them around, attend, and so on. Is that Regie? The question is almost irrelevant. It's just a wonderful piece of theater. It's opera, it's a living opera. Or, for instance, on the other hand, if you look at the last Chéreau staging, is it Regie? You'd probably call it more traditional, the Electra from the X. But it has such an interesting coherence, psychological coherence, so tightly directed. It has so much, psychoanalytical knowledge in it that you wouldn't really call it a traditional production. So I guess I'm arguing in favor of melting away this border between Regie and traditional that is still so lively here, whereas in the rest of the opera world, that's not the question. There are some other questions, and some of those have been raised here.
I think that would be a good moment to introduce Mahler's definition of tradition. I don't even know how to translate that into English. He said tradition is schlamperei. It's like laziness, sloppiness, getting used to things and then not wanting to change them anymore.
Yeah.
And then completely forgetting what the original impact was.
Well, and maybe that's a question for you, Joel, because you sort of, in terms of Regie directors, you're in a sort of cloudy area.
Regie director.
He's the worst revisionist of us all.
Yeah. With the first question, it's kind of the thing is, in North America anyways, we're only spoon-fed one, maybe two things, and we've been eating the same thing for a certain time until a change happens, which mixes things up. So you just get, I find that opera fans are kind of the most passionate people ever. They just love what they love. And that's what's hard, is when you introduce new foods, they either want to keep what they like to eat, or they're willing to try new things. And that's kind of once you just start making the pool a little bit bigger, you're just a little bit outside of your comfort zone, and people who are more passionate will make that known, or if they're in trying something new and they like that, then they'll like that as well. So I think they're polarizing just because they're so passionate and into what they like, which is kind of what opera is. It just pulls you in, whether it's in I don't even know exactly what traditional means or what cutting edge avant-garde is. If they like it, they'll like it, and that's what's great, I think.
Well, I've been involved in quite a few quote-unquote weird productions, and polarizing as well. And for me, as long as it makes sense, or if there's an emotional journey for my character, it makes sense to me, and it's exciting. And I've done traditional productions that were boring as crap. So for me, as long as it's a vital experience. And so if a director comes with a new idea or a new concept or a new location for the production, that's exciting. It keeps it fresh for me as a performer, and I think that audiences respond to the vitality that they see on the stage. So if the director's making me think about my character in a different way, that it brings it to life in a new way. Whereas I've seen Met productions that I've nearly fallen asleep at that were quote-unquote traditional, because we are being spoon-fed, and I'm not interested in that as a performer, and I'm not interested in that as an audience member.
What do you think is the job of the director? Like, what do you expect from someone when you come into a production? Who's supposed to direct you?
Who's supposed to? Well, I mean, I don't know. I feel like, the director always comes with a concept, and I like to, when I meet the director, I like to assess what the concept is and how I can find my own voice within that concept. And a good director will give you some ideas and then back off and let you express at the same time and find that balance within the character.
Well, every opera that I get the opportunity to direct, if I don't have a reason to do that show, then I'd like to believe that I won't do it. So I have to find a reason why it's important to do that show, and if it's engaging and relevant to me, as someone who is interested in that work, then I feel that it may relate to someone else. So for me, it's if there's a reason why this story needs to be told in this way, then that's good storytelling, and that will work. So it's not trying to say, well, what is a modern audience going to enjoy, or let's have it look this way because this will be really exciting, but just what's the best way to tell this story right now? So that's how I approach things.
I think it's a great answer.
Yeah.
But because you asked, I think it's as much the performers and the conductors' job to keep the art form alive. I think it's not something that's the director's job. The director's part of a team. And, what never works in traditional or non-traditional, if the director and the conductor are not able to motivate their team, it's not going to happen.
We're getting away from that, though, aren't we? The focus we're putting on the director. Who directed the original production of Così fan tutte? Who directed no, we don't know. We didn't care. We cared originally who created it, and then in our century who conducted it. But when it becomes a Chernikov production, when it becomes a Sellers production, the conductor, it seems to me, take second place, and the music can therefore maybe not be completely integrated into the conception.
Yeah, but I think that's a 19th century problem, that we have come to expect like the genius that takes over and shows us something that's beyond our own understanding. And we're still in that cult. It's almost a cult that it's not an egalitarian thing. And the worst example is Wagner, probably. Like the bigger than life everything.
But isn't that the way we're marketing Peter Sellers these days, or Chernikov? Is precisely that kind of, quote, genius that has... So we, in fact, are encouraged to go to these productions to see that conception. Are we moving too far in making these people, the chief creative force in this thing?
I think it's a moving target. It can be a lead singer, it can also be the conductor. And it changes from case to case. I mean, again, when we get to the Don Giovanni discussion, but what was so extraordinary for me about this particular production here is that he was actually able to make everybody do it in a very convincing way. Because people always tend to think that we as producing organizations or directors, we enslave a group of singers. And we make them do things that they really, really don't want to do. And because they're so afraid that they're not going to be hired back, they stick with it. And it's just not the way. I mean, Krisztina, I'd be happy to hear what you have to say. I mean, obviously you want to be hired back and you don't want to create a scandal, but you can mechanically execute what you're asked to do, or you can fill it with meaning. But you can only fill it with meaning when you're motivated. I mean, to a certain extent, you understand what you're asked to do.
Yes. It's more interesting as a performer to be motivated to find. You can't. I've done productions where it's just mechanical and it's deadly. It's not interesting to me. So, like I said, it keeps it alive if I'm engaged in the concept. If I'm personally engaged. So if a director motivates me in that way, that's exciting.
And I guess it's not interesting for the audience, because how can you transmit something as a performer if you're not convinced of what you're doing? And I think it's in a way easier for the performers than for the audience, because the performers are part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you have 4-6 weeks to get into that world. The audience has a couple of minutes.
I use this so often, do it again here, that as far as I'm concerned, if the unexamined repertoire is not worth giving. It really needs to be, in 2015, you take these old works, some keys need to be use to unlock it. And it's, Figaro does not work to me as a battle of the classes. It just doesn't. And so you've got to rethink it in some way. And I sort of want the director's voice to be strong. I mean, I really do take seriously the fact that the director, the designer, the lighting designer, the video, whatever, that whole thing is a creative team and has a creative voice. And I want to be challenged by them in the same way I want to be challenged by the conductor and by the singers and their interpretation as well. I don't think, don't want to start a different kind of discussion here, but I'm not a person who thinks that opera is all about singing. It's all about everything else as well. And so I'm happy to have this emphasis on the director. I think it's a little bit, journalistically there is a little bit of a problem because you do always hear about it being the Chernikov production, as if there were no conductor or a lighting designer or singers and so on. And that is a problem, I admit, but it's not a fundamental problem of what's at issue here, I don't think.
And also the diva or diva vehicle as well. There's that as well. Some productions clearly there because a singer wanted it.
Yeah, although that realistically, that rarely happens.
That's good to know.
Because I think it's for me, from a planning point of view, I would never put all my money on one horse. Yeah. And especially on a singer, because a singer can get sick, and then you plan that whole thing around one person, and something happens, and the reason for that whole project to exist goes away. Probably in that sense, the riskiest thing we've done ever was Don Quixote, which, without Ferruccio Furlanetto, would have imploded.
That
was a bit of a singer vehicle.
Yeah, because let's not talk about Massenet. But no, definitely. But then also, he's such an extraordinary artist that I knew he would be able to give it life. I wouldn't have programmed it because I'm a lover of Massenet.
I was just going to take it in a completely different direction for a moment, because I agree with Joel as he began the sort of speaking of the relevance of the director, the role of the director in keeping opera relevant. But after hearing Wayne's point, I sort of thought it's an interesting idea to think that the role of director in keeping opera relevant is actually to replace the original relevance of the piece, because when it was created, it would have been relevant. As a topicality, as a musical aesthetic, and certainly the authors and the creators were part of sort of a more embracing culture that we would have to have a really tough argument right now to say our composers and writers are, well, if new operas were being done on a regular basis in major opera houses in Canada. So that from a global point of view, the role of the director is now to refresh the relevance of the piece that no longer exists. Whereas if pieces were being created anew, then the relevance would be built in there, or certainly in the ones that are successful and go on to stay in the repertoire.
I don't think the relevance needs refreshing. I think that's always there.
I do. I honestly think that when the people I talk to and who are astonished that I work in opera because it's such a bizarre, strange corner of the world, they say, why? I've gone to it, it's not in my language, I don't quite understand the stories, and then sometimes they're challenged even further. And these are talking people who have no connection to begin with, other than maybe hearing soundtracks that are rip-offs of operas that we know in movies. The big things that they come across are the language, the highly stylized art form, that even though we say there's a lot of new things in them, there's still tons and tons of tradition and how it's presented in a big opera house, which is no longer sort of a contemporary experience. These are things that I think are less and less relevant.
Tim Albury's Aida, which I loved so much, really saved that opera for me. I wouldn't have gone if it was pyramids and all that kind of stuff. Would be not interested. You can listen to at home, you can listen to various arias, and that's fine. But would you go to watch Aida with pyramids and Egyptian imagery? I don't think so. Whereas that one, exactly what a good director does, yeah.
And that, of course, was one of the things that people got the most upset
about.
That we refused them the pyramids. Although what they really got the most upset about was Sandra's dress and shoes. But it's a very tricky problem. I'm trying to get to a point here. And I'm maybe just asking this as a question. Whether it's an old piece or a new piece, I don't know how big the difference is, because it's in need of interpretation and it's in need of performance. Like, I think it's completely naive to think that you can just somehow faithfully reproduce what's printed in the score. Because there's so many decisions that you have to make. And they may be big or small, but you can start with the musical interpretation. I mean, there's a million ways to go. Mm-hmm. Like, there's no absolute tempo, phrasing. And then even if scores are very, very accurately marked, you'll still not get anybody to do, you won't get two conductors to do exactly the same thing with one score. And then you put it on the stage, and it's an added complication. It asks for decisions, and it has to do with the space that you perform it in, the people that you have.
Now, Michael, I'm curious if it was one of the questions that I'd like to ask a little later, but it's coming up now. Does the sort of trend in, like, Regie trend suggest that some of the operas in the standard repertoire cannot stand on their own with a sort of traditional staging or traditional music cuts or lack thereof?
Is that a question for me?
Eventually, yes.
I'd say yes. For me, certain pieces in the canonical repertoire are not salvageable, other than as a recording that you listen to. I wouldn't go. I mean, as a member of the audience and as a writer, I wouldn't go. I wouldn't be interested. So this Aida is a good example. I can't remember last time I went to see, what's that other Orientalist opera by Verdi, Nabucco. I don't think I'd go to see that again.
Why not?
It doesn't tell me anything.
But
We've seen that in old Hollywood films. It's Cecil B. DeMille, 19th century version.
But of course, in Verdi's time, people thought it was so great because
For different
it
reasons.
told the story of the Austrian suppression of Italy.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's what he had in mind, but that's how it was
So
understood.
it's taken.
And Va Pensiero became an anthem
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah. I think, that's an interesting question you pose. I hadn't quite thought of it like that. I mean, the one that comes to mind for me is like Bohème, which I don't think lends itself to Regietheater at all. I mean, it's very difficult. I've seen it updated to the 30s, or actually the 40s, so German-occupied Paris, and
There's some contemporary, like the one in Anna Netrebko.
yeah, there's some, but it doesn't really. But it doesn't lend itself to the kind of reworking that Don Giovanni lent itself to, for example. But as soon as I get in the theater, I think, oh no, another Bohème. Okay. As soon as that music starts up, I'm right in there with it. And I think the recent COC one actually is a very good example of how you don't have to have a strong interpretive approach to the staging to make the thing work in a very fresh way, I think.
Yeah, I think Puccini is kind of a special position in the repertoire. I think this.
Are you going to make him a second-class citizen? Is that what we're going to do?
No, I mean, my former boss and mentor.
Before or after
my
Massenet?
former boss and mentor would have. I mean, for me, Massenet is way down the food chain. But Puccini is right. I think those in a way, Bohème and Tosca, they're masterpieces.
Yeah.
They're not dramaturgical masterpieces.
No. And that's why I think they don't lend themselves very well to.
Well, they don't need it. I mean,
Yeah.
there's nothing that could be added. On the other hand, you take something like Butterfly, and I may be the only person in Toronto that felt the racism in that, not your production, but in it so vividly.
You're not the only one.
That's
You're not the
another
only
good example.
one.
Yeah, it's a good example.
Everybody I talked to said, "Why are we still doing Butterfly?" It seems like
why,
such
but
a.
I mean, here's a
That
production
would be
that could have, someone might have taken that on had they chosen to. I mean, maybe not. But it seems to be certain operas, like the Ring. The notion that the Ring might be about capitalism surely was part of Wagner's idea. I mean, it's hard not to believe that wasn't in the back of his mind. So the notion that would be brought forward, or the notion that we might see Don Giovanni as an old man rather than a young man, I thought was such a fascinating idea. I mean, despite the difficulties in the production, in other words, it seems to be some operas lend themselves to a different that kind of depth, and others don't need it.
This is it.
Well, but also I think it shows you the strength of those works, and it also shows you you cannot do justice to them in one single version or interpretation. I think that's more than, from my perspective, I don't feel the need to refresh the repertoire necessarily by doing things differently. I feel there is an unlimited number of possibilities with to put a masterpiece on stage. And what I would try to do with our audience is to give them an idea that we're not, I always say we're not a school. Like, I'm not teaching opera to the audience. But we want to engage them and want to help them to find their own understanding of a piece, but we also, I don't want to tell them the truth about Don Giovanni. I have no idea what the truth about Don Giovanni is. Like, I hope that, you know, the accumulation of all the Don Giovannis of my life at some point will give me an idea of what that piece is about. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think it's a problem that you have with the new work, to get people excited about the new work and get the first understanding, but also make it clear to them that one viewing of something that's a great work of art will merely scratch the surface of, you know, all the things that that piece of art can be or mean. And then, of course, the older it gets, the more history gets loaded onto it. And I think it's fair to say that you know, it's like research. When people come to me and say, why don't you just do operas the way they're supposed to be done? you want to ask them, are you a creationist? You know, or do you really, because no science would be possible with that approach. You know, like, we would still be living in caves if we weren't allowed to look for something new that's coming out of the old. I think it's a very human instinct. That's why we're not just repeating it the way it has been done all the time.
But surely this connects with new opera. I mean, because it seems to me that, you know, there's a lot of diminishing returns about every year about how much new you can pull out of, you know, things that are 100 and some odd years old. You know, Krisztina was just involved in Written on Skin. They did a concert version. You know, there's a modern opera that I would say is unbelievably accessible, although written in the contemporary language. And again, they presented in a concert version. But when you see the DVD, there's hardly anything unusual about the staging of modern, but nothing. So there's sort of the other, and again, those come along few and far between, clearly. And that was what, a 2-year, 3-year experience of him to write that pieces, which is normal. You know, so I think that, you know, because we don't have the constant new as the 19th century did, you know, I mean, you were constantly expected to produce something new. We find our need for novelty, our need for the new, imposed on these works that are old, you know. And also, I think part of it, and I don't know if this is one of you, we've lost the ability to fail. We can't fail. No one's allowed to fail. You know, and all of these productions were failures. Carmen was a failure. These things were failures, and it was understood because, you know, it's obviously a different world, and I'm not trying to remake the world, but man, what a difference that makes when nothing can fail.
Yeah. I think that's a big gauntlet for new works too. But part of it is, you know, talking to this idea that regie exists as a concept only in North America, Lydia. It's also the fact that we only get so many operas in North America, and so if the third biggest company in the city has a bigger budget than the COC, but it's because they're putting on 20 shows, then that means that people have encountered it so many times, and so it's the Thanksgiving dinner that you have 20 times a year. You feel like you can make variation in it, but if you only get it once a year, then people can be a bit more purist about it and say, well, not purist, but they can be a bit more sacred about it and say it should be the same. This is what I know and like, and it's the thing that I get 5 times a year and that's it, or 4 times a year and that's it. Part of the problem is we don't have a culture that we're not allowed to do that many because of the cost of the singers, because of the cost of the spectacle, because of the lack of the taste of the people around us, or perhaps just the encountering of the people around us to the genre, because we all come from a background that trained us in classical music in some way, or from Europe, which is the equivalent. And I think that's at the crux of it, really.
I guess it's a twofold question. The idea of the director, you know, the Chernikov production or the Robert Carson production, does it require that the audience kind of know a traditional version of said production to understand what's actually being done in this, you know, new one? And does it add another layer of you need to be in the know in order to get something out of it?
No, I don't think so at all. If someone wants to, that's great, and it can help them understand things. Maybe if it's in a different language and you don't always like looking up to follow the plot, but I don't think so. Sorry, that's a very short answer.
I would agree with that. Yeah. I mean, in a way, you know, we've spoken about the multiple entry points. At some point, your first Rigoletto is going to be your first Rigoletto, and that's going to be your first reference with that piece. And all the other ones you will measure. I don't know, you know. I think there's no, because it's not standardized. Like there's no standard reference version.
Yeah, and you're not.
I would disagree with all of the yeses. Sorry, I'll let Robert go first.
No, I was just going to say, I'm going to disagree as well. Go ahead. I disagree.
No, I completely agree that directors can ruin a piece, and in fact ruin an audience member from opera completely by directing some completely crap idea of something that would be interesting to someone who'd seen it 20 times and was looking for anything that would surprise them and maybe provide insight. And maybe, again, that specific version provides insight into the character at this moment, this moment, and this moment, but as a complete, it doesn't work unless you have all of those pieces in place already. I've seen a bunch of shows like that, mostly in Germany.
But that's just bad directing.
Absolutely, but it's so. But I'm not.
But if that
exists. Bad directing exists.
If that Chernyakov was the first Don Giovanni you had ever seen, you would have been completely and utterly confused. I mean, it wasn't bad. Just because so much of the value of that piece was for you to know the irony based on the original. You needed. I mean, that was part of the conception.
Yeah,
for that one. Maybe that was an exception, but if the first Clemenza I had ever seen was your version, I think I would understand it less. Not at all, if I didn't have a reference.
And like the feedback that I get from people that see something for the first time, and let's say that Don Giovanni, some people say they didn't understand it. Other people say, I had no idea it would be so much about me and not stuffy and old.
Yeah.
And I think it's underestimating the intelligence of the audience. I think the audience is able to understand irony or a certain interaction with the text that's not literal. But again, it's a very individual thing. What also happens is that people come to see something like Don Giovanni and they just really did want a confirmation of their idea of opera, even though they have never seen one, and they say, well, that's really not what I expected.
For me, as long as there's an access point into the character, it's emotionally, psychologically, some access point, that's how I approach a character. But and each production is going to offer something different, hopefully, so that I'll find different points into the character, new ways to delve into that.
But again, I think we're not there to tell people what it means. We're there to tell them what it could mean. And I think that's a really important difference. I don't know how you see that, Joel, because you're kind of really on the ground and you're developing it. And I think it's very preposterous to think you can just put it on the table and say that's what it is. And I think that's a problem with the audience here, that they really expect you to do exactly that and to figure out a way which is respectful to say we actually can't do that, but that doesn't mean we're failing constantly.
I guess we tend to forget that people bring in other arts and film that they've consumed to these opera, and not everybody is an opera completist like most of us here. They don't want to see a closer to the tradition of Don Giovanni. They just want to see that one. They dip here, they dip there. And for instance, I'm thinking this Klaus Guth notes that Alexander is bringing. I think a lot of people who love Bergman will be at home in that production without ever having seen a traditional.
It's interesting, we talked about the one Don Giovanni that was presented, but there were two Don Giovannis presented in the last few months, and of course Joel presented the other one, Uncle John, which he completely rewrote the libretto from start to finish. And the two productions to me were both brilliant. I mean, I loved them both. They were completely different, and the reason I loved them both was both of them told me what Don Giovanni was really about, or whatever. In other words, both gave me an insight into whatever meaning it has from a completely different perspective. Your Uncle John, put it in, the obviously modern day concept, but everything about it other than that was pretty authentic. I thought obviously the score was authentic, and it really interested me in terms, and I was thinking that, this term we talk about directors and opera, it's such a wide, it's either a term that has no meaning at all, as like it says, or it has such a wide meaning, because both of what you, Joel, did and what Chernyakov did fall under this concept, and they were so completely and utterly different. and yet both had value, I thought.
Going back, the thing that is important, or what you strive for when you're running a company, you're trying, that's another thing for being a director as well, but it's whether someone likes it or not, will they come back to try something again? And if it is their first time, it's not, for me, it's not just what is their experience with that particular piece, but what is it like when you buy your ticket, when you meet someone who you give your ticket to on the way in, and that whole experience. And to me, the piece goes as well as sort of the customer service and all that, the experience of going into the Four Seasons Center and seeing the cultural hub of your city and just what that encapsulates as well. So for me, if someone doesn't like Uncle John, I hope that they'll say, we didn't really like this one, but we like other stuff you've done, or we didn't really like this, but we'll give this another try because we liked the environment we were in as well, where we could sit and have a drink and spill it on the ground and it's not the end of the world kind of thing.
Is there a line, does an ethical line or something similar exist for you between, interpretation of a story and then superimposing another story onto an opera? Does it exist for you, and where would it be if you know?
I think for me it exists in that you can't fight the music. So if someone decides to put something new on a piece, I think I love to see people exploring things, but you need to be supported by the orchestration. You need to be supported by the score and the way that it grows musically. Otherwise, the thing that frustrates me the most is when there's something incredibly obvious happening in the music, and then the director decides to do something that maybe they think is ironic, or they just haven't listened enough, and then it's lost. And the journey that doesn't change is the musical journey. For me,
if it's already happening in the music, does the director have to repeat it on stage?
No, but they need to not ignore it completely. It doesn't need to be copied, doesn't need to be literal, there's a gesture that Mozart does that sounds like someone stops moving. I don't think people have to stop moving, but you have to acknowledge that that mood that's been created by the music exists, and if you fight it, people will just be confused.
But are you, this is a straight question, are you suggesting there's a double standard here, that it cannot go against the music, but it's okay to go against the text? And I ask that as a neutral question. It's not loaded, because
I think that with exceptions of certain composers, I think they're one and the same. I think that the text can be changed, but the one thing that we don't do is recompose at the big opera houses. But text has been translated and reset and done where the arias are done in original language and the rest in the language of the Volga.
But it's interesting, it's a philosophy that actually says that the music is more important than the words.
Yeah.
Right.
And opera is the one theater form where the conductor has slightly more power than the director often.
I'd just say that I wouldn't be a priori against cuts. I think you did some interesting cuts in your adaptations. I think you got rid of Mazzetta pretty much completely. Almost. In Don Giovanni, there was no Mazzetta aria. It's fine, good. And I didn't know that people actually dare cut Verdi and Wagner as well. I think, honestly, I wouldn't be. I'm agnostic about musical cuts too. I don't think that's where we should draw the line. I think when we look at the Baroque operas now, we're sort of fine with cuts here and there, and with Mozart as well. There are debates if it's okay to cut or not. But when you come to the 19th century, people are all up in the arms about the work of art not being touched. But I don't think there is a line for sure, but I don't think that's the line. I think we should go into the score as well occasionally.
But why really? I mean, that's a question that I ask myself all the time. And first of all, when you do certain works, let's say like Magic Flute, the first question always is, wouldn't it be better to do it in English here? But of course, changing the language changes the character of the music.
More so in some operas than in others, though.
I think there's really not a big difference. Like you try to do Bohème in English, it's a different. You've done it. It's a different. Yeah. It becomes a different piece. Or you would try to do It's Castle in English. No.
Of course, she's
already learned it.
I mean, it's funny. I mean, the Met just did that production of Violante and Lubitz Castle. It's the first time in the history of the method, they performed Bluebeard in Hungarian. And they've done that piece before. So it seems to be kind of, I think it comes down to the discussion, what are you allowed to do with standard repertoire and what you're allowed to do with non-standard repertoire. And there seems to be a double standard.
You know, it interests me how different, how different this is in the theater than it is in opera. You know, has anyone presented Hamlet the way it's been written in the first folio? Never. People rearrange scenes because they've decided that some prompter wrote it in the wrong order and they just put it in a different order and they cut it at will and nobody blinks an eye, you know? And it's the same purist. We're talking about Shakespeare. I mean, in some ways more pure to Western culture than any opera, and maybe it's because of the power of music and that music affects us more emotionally, so we miss it more when it's not there. But it's interesting, you talk about ethics. You know, these are not ethical questions, you know. I mean, but there are ethical questions, I think, and there maybe, you know. And I was the one who mentioned, you know, the racism of Butterfly. But it seems to me that art is a place where there aren't any ethical questions. That's its danger, and that's its excitement. Is that it's the place where you can go where conventional questions of ethics fall away. Because I mean, if you want to complain about ethics, about changing the story, talk to Verdi. And Piave about about Traviata. They not only changed the ending from La Dama, I mean, they reversed it, right? In the original story, the Alfredo character does not come back to reconcile with Violetta. He doesn't find out about her sacrifice until she's dead. That's sort of a small change. That's kind of a major change to make, and nobody has complained that I've ever heard about that change in Traviata. So you want art to be ethical, but it seems to me that the demand for ethics is really a stranglehold, and the key is, you know, I mean, what's Don Giovanni, you know? I mean, it's basically as unethical an opera as was possible at the time, you know, seemingly celebrating what would ethically be considered horrible behavior, right? So
this notion of purism that we were talking about earlier on this afternoon is really what the problem is here, is that we are maybe, or there is an ethos out there where we're being too pure for our own good. Because if you go back again and look at performance practice in the 19th century, and things were being changed left, right, and center all the time. You know, arias lifted from one opera, dumped into another. Don Giovanni was sung by a tenor for a good part of the 19th century. I mean, this baseline, which you referred to in the previous question, doesn't really exist. It's kind of in our minds, or in somebody's mind somewhere. So, it's either going to work or it isn't going to work. And then that, I think, really does come down to a very individual response to what you're seeing on the stage.
But doesn't show that to you how much it is still a living and breathing art form?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I happened to listen to, on my way to work this morning, to Callas' second Norma recording with Ludwig and Corelli and conducted by Serafin, not the text of the Ur score, you know, the heavily cut and arranged, conducted in a very romantic way, and you put that next to Cecilia Bartoli recording Norma and singing Norma with period instruments. And it's almost not the same piece. It might look like the same piece on the paper, but from the listening experience, it's hard to believe. And yet, you know, Callas and Sutherland and those people are credited for rediscovering bel canto, maybe in a way that bel canto never existed.
Can I ask a question of all of us, if you don't mind? So I think a lot of us would probably agree with you sitting here, because we approach going to the opera in a completely different way than it seems that many of the audience members do. In other words, we're looking, I mean, the fact that it's different is interesting to us because we're not expecting, you know, whatever that purist. Is this a class thing? I mean, I say this, and it's maybe I'd be shot down by every one of you. In other words, we think of North America as a classless society, of course, but you wonder whether part of this isn't, I have a special place in society, and the reason I need these operas to be the way they may, I mean, it's a nostalgia for something you've never experienced yourself, right? In other words, is because it helps correspond to my view of myself as a person. I mean, is that completely absurd, or is there an element to that?
I think it's a class thing in the inherent racism in opera, and that there's, I don't know any non-European composers that have been performed in major houses in recent years, really. With very, very few exceptions.
There are exceptions. I mean,
but the audience.
it happens to be a Western European art form.
Well, it happened to start as a Western European art form. You would never say painting was a Western European art form, for example, or dance.
No.
Because it wasn't.
But opera
Because it
as
wasn't.
Right. But the tradition of putting drama and music together with vocal arts is something that has grown and expanded to other places. One of those being North America, one of those being Toronto. And my question is that if it's actually living and breathing, does it have anything to do with the time we live in, apart from the fact that there's these universal things in great art and great masterpieces, which is something that I have. This is my biggest issue with opera, and people repeating works and riffing off of works, and the whole idea that regie is a thing. And I think what's living and breathing is the imaginations of directors when given masterworks, but not necessarily the art form itself, not the creation of it. And that's the biggest problem for it really to carry on, because the trend in all of North America, and this is from really good metrics, is that every company is experiencing fewer and fewer audience attendance. Not necessarily percentages, but the number of tickets sold is going down everywhere. And is the class distinction because those people who connect to a post-colonial kind of identity, is that's what's important, that's what signifies that someone is educated or cultured? Is that what being part of the opera scene is? Or is there an opening for North America as it is, but which would require great refreshing of the repertoire, in fact? Because I think the class thing is inherent in what opera is.
I think it's also naive.
Class as relates to a post-colonial
I think it's naive
identity.
to believe that it's a mass art form. It never was anywhere.
Well, it was a popular music in the late 1800s. Operetta.
But attended operetta, but operetta is not opera. Like
it's in the same tradition certainly in the same tradition.
Well, I think when you look at the percentage of the population that participates in high art, it's definitely lower in North America than it would be in Europe. But it's not a majority of the population in Europe either.
I wasn't arguing that it was.
I mean, there's limits from the size of the performance spaces, which is a more practical barrier, but I think you need, I like to think of it like as a pyramid or a food chain. There needs to be a top and a bottom. And that doesn't really mean that the bottom is better than the top or the other way around. But not everything is equally accessible to everybody.
How do you mean? Just the fact that less people participate. Well, fewer and fewer is a trend, which is different than
I don't actually know if fewer is a trend. I mean,
I think from the numbers that Opera America has been processing.
Well, I mean, opera in this part of the world very heavily depends on economic cycles with the tickets. So I don't really think people are disinterested by the art form. They feel it's not affordable for them.
Yeah.
That is a way bigger problem that they get disenfranchised. It's some, if I know what our tickets cost. You know what our tickets cost. It's and that is actually not a choice.
Yeah.
It's a necessity to make our business model work.
Yeah.
When we discount, if I sell $50 tickets for everything, I can fill the house for anything. For the most difficult out there opera, if the ticket is cheap enough, I can fill the house.
Just a quick stat for you. I read somewhere recently that can you guess the country in which Western classical and opera are experiencing the highest growth in the world? China, and also Korea. So I think race-wise, some interesting things are going to be happening in the next 20, 30 years. It's not going to be a white man's art form, if it ever was. I don't think it ever was.
I mean, the best-selling classical music artist is the Chinese pianist, I would guess. Right?
Yes, in the West as well,
Yeah, we hopefully we're not having that conversation anymore. That was, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
That was a thing. I'm more concerned that it's just irrelevant because it's not really evolved to the 21st century in Toronto.
Well, I would claim it has. The simple fact that we perform it makes it part of what we are and who we are. I mean, I'm not running a museum. Okay. Like, I wasn't hired to run a museum, and I don't think I'm running one. And the fact that we do Don Giovanni today, I would claim we do opera for 21st century people with 21st century people. Like, I don't necessarily, when a composer sends me a new score, I don't look at that differently than at, let's say, a lesser known 19th century work. You know, I think you have to apply similar standards.
Absolutely.
No, like obviously there's the selling and the not so well selling pieces. But let's say let's not talk about sales, because there's some things that are popular and not popular. But of all the not popular stuff, you know, which is about 99% of
The repertoire.
of the repertoire.
Yeah.
Like I don't make my choices whether it's old or new. That's actually not a determining factor. I look at it, you know, maybe, let's say when Barbara Monk-Feldman sent me her score for Pyramus and Thisbe, I didn't like it better because it was new, or I didn't like it less either. I just looked at it and I found this is really interesting. And that's why we program it. And I would look, you know,
But that's,
and in a way I look exactly the same way at Momento Secondo.
yeah.
You know, it's a piece that I hadn't known, I encountered, and I thought, well, this will be great as part of our season. It's not going to revolutionize the box office, but neither is, you know, a new Canadian opera going to revolutionize the box office, and that's can't be the reason why we're doing it. You know, I think when you put that forward with the weight and integrity of your organization, you try to bring it to people that don't know if they would like it.
Sure, I applaud you for those choices, and I think that has to be the way forward. But I think that it is incorrect to say that most opera houses aren't museums in performing 100-year-old or more than 100-year-old pieces on a regular basis, with no exception for anything younger. And then maybe because we can only do 2 to 5 a year for most of the companies in Canada.
Like even 100 years ago, before recording of sound and image was even possible, culture was way more contemporary than it's now, because people had no access to the old, other than, you know, paintings,
And manuscripts.
really, and manuscripts. But it was not accessible. It was hidden in libraries. You know, that today you can find anything on the internet or on YouTube. You know, you're living in an environment that determines your possibilities, and those possibilities were much more limited. I mean, you go back to the Baroque period. For a score to travel to another city or to another country, that was a huge thing. You know, I mean, today we get very picky about singers because we have all those recordings of operas going back 100 years now. I mean, when you were like in a, let's say, Toronto Opera 100 years ago, people had no frame of reference if they didn't travel. And did people have a frame of reference anywhere else. And they had the singers that were there, and they probably thought that's as good as opera gets.
So what's with the hat?
I was inspired when I knew that we would be talking about Regietheater and its application to opera. I thought that I would bring a great and interesting and completely irrelevant frame for the human being that I am, which is just to say that you can pick the perfect outfit, and sometimes it does change people's impression of you, but it doesn't actually change who you are. And as a lover of theater and of music, I find the most exciting thing to be finding those genuine people, those new beings that at the core are surprising and beautiful because of their relevance in the moment, in the time that they're created. And so this is only to say, as much as I love Regie and some of the brilliant people that are out there and hate some of the crappy stuff that's out there, we don't need costumes for great works, we need new great works.
All right. One of the commenters on Schmopera.com, so he talks about longevity, and he's directing his question specifically to you, and you, Michael, and you, Joel, but he'd like to hear from everyone. So it's about, his question is, how many original works that seem so urgent and compelling in the contemporary indie opera showplace are likely to resurface in 50, 10, or 5 years? Is durability even an issue, or is the genre, like television, essentially disposable after limited plays? Please don't interpret this as a challenge. I'm extremely curious to hear the panel's take, particularly Joel and Michael.
But Bohème was a big thing, right? And that happened more than once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did it once, then we did it again that fall just because it went well, and we'd love to do it again. But part of what, like Uncle John, technically, just because of technology, won't be relevant in 5-10 years, and that's fine. In my mind, you can just update it. So it's kind of like, if something, and that's the freedom I hold on those things that I can just change it. So, because I wrote it, I can throw that out and just do something else new, which is kind of different. So I totally expect them not to be completely relevant after a while, and art changes, I change. I'm going to be a lot older then as well in 50 years, my goodness. So
Durability, I think it's more momentum, which is kind of a different way of looking at the same thing. If a piece, and we just did TapX Tables Turned a couple weeks ago, and this was a piece where Nicole Lisée, sort of multimedia composer, took turntables, recordings of great movies, recordings of Maria Callas, and spun them against Karla Huitinen. I think that this piece has already gained momentum in the small circles that we have, and I will push for it to be seen elsewhere because it's a very exciting piece, and it's certainly something that is interesting in changing the texture of what's possible in the musical world of opera. But if it gains enough momentum, then it becomes durable. You know, if enough people see it and are influenced by it, and it sort of becomes part of a great artistic conversation that's happening where creators are creating art, paint, literature, then yeah, I think that's the exciting thing. There's definitely going to be ones that don't ever reach that sort of velocity, and maybe just have one run of performances, which is no different in theater or new music really. But the ones that, you know, what we're looking for are the people who have that inspiration, who have that new fresh voice, and who have a kind of grasp of the world that we live in today, to find that again, momentum that can then be durable and say there's something in this that's universal. There's also something in this that's extremely topical and exciting.
I think there's an issue here that is beyond the indie companies, though. I mean, having been following opera sort of professionally for like a couple of decades now, I've lost count of the number of new works I've seen, world premieres in Canada, not just by the small companies, but by the main stage companies as well. And I can count on one hand how many times I've had the opportunity to see any one of those twice. I mean, there is a real issue, I think. We've been talking about, you know, revamping old works, or, you know, new, or developing opera through new works, and which is fine. I think it's the issue is to do both of these things. Some works, as Joel said, may sort of go out, have built-in obsolescence because of technology or whatever. But I have some works that don't, and I would dearly love to see them again, and they never get a chance. And I think that's a real issue.
I think it's a particular challenge here just because of the relatively small size of the whole scene, that second performances are really challenging. Yeah. But, you know, I think durability reminds me of something that Robert said: we're not allowed to fail anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, in Handel's time, in Mozart's time, in Verdi's time, most of the new works failed. Because that's just the nature of creating successful art. We don't create continued series of masterpieces. Nobody does that. I mean, you think about how many of Verdi's contemporaries you remember top of your mind.
No, I buy into the fact that you know, things over time will disappear and the cream stays at the surface, as it were. But, you know, just to take many years of watching productions of Tapestry, all the things that have been done there, how often they get back, how many Negreda hotels are there? I mean, out of all the things.
Negreda Hotel's been performed.
No, that one has. I mean, that's why
right,
I used that one.
Yeah.
But it's true. I mean, you know, I'd dearly love to see Krisztina as a Queen Ant again. But, you know, once that
Well, you know, there's an interesting thing, is because that was a partnership with Tarragon, and it actually had a run of 3 weeks straight.
Right.
As the first run. One of the biggest problems with new works, especially in opera, is because opera is this expensive thing. We get a run of a week, or 4 performances, or 6 performances, where if you want people to spread the word and say, this is so incredible, all of you people who don't already know about this company, come and see it, you need to have at least 2 weeks. At best, 3 to 4 weeks. And if you want something to pick up traction, you have to let the word spread to people outside the people who are just I'll take everything that you guys do because I love you. We want you want to be able to embrace the general population who's saying, well, we're going to come if someone we trust says it's great. If we had the ability to do longer runs, and that's certainly something I'm aiming to change at Tapestry, then I think exponentially our options for finding second runs, because we've proven that it's a viable and a successful production, go up.
Just as you were all talking, I was trying to think of living composers who have seen the repeat restagings of their work, and maybe you can help me. I mean, Kaya Sariaho has seen some of her works.
John Adams, Philip Glass.
That's it. Anna Sokolovic's Svadba is now being taken at the X. Gerald Barry, then Rim also has his stuff re-performed.
Sharino.
Yeah. So
I mean, it does exist.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this is I think our Canadian opera world is a little bit insular that way, and because we're kind of sitting in between the US and Europe, I'm really very excited that Anna is making it to Europe.
absolutely.
I think it's definitely one of the composers of the Canadian public who deserves to make that step. But it's hard for us to get people in here to see those works. And I think that's one of the big problems, to get people to come from Europe or to come from the States and actually see what is done here.
I mean, Svadba itself, when it first opened, had difficulty selling tickets, and it was at Berkeley stage, and it wasn't the cheapest tickets, $50, but still they couldn't fill it, and there weren't that many reviews and so on, so it's difficult.
Yeah, the question of durability cuts. It's very hard. Your correspondent talks about television as the disposable medium. Well, he's wrong, actually, because we're still watching I Love Lucy's from 1953, and I'm not kidding. And Little Richard, to take pop music, the least durable form of music. The recordings he made in 1957 in literally 20 minutes to put into a jukebox in Atlanta for 3 weeks, are still being listened to today. So you can never be sure. Like it's so unpredictable, it seems. Despite all of the logistical problems, the things that actually become hits, the things that have a life, are not easy to tell when they first appear. Not easy to tell at all. Maybe that's a goal we should be setting for ourselves. Durability. I don't know. I'm just putting that out as a question.
But I think we just need to be careful that we don't follow the sort of new music way of doing things, which is to take a year and a half to work on something and then do it in one performance for a room filled with 50 people who already know and love you, and they don't have any connections or ability to take the work elsewhere, even if it is wonderful. And so there's a lot we can do to not have that. But I think what Alexander says is completely true. We're just we haven't become a world stop necessarily, and certainly those of us who are trying adventurous new things on a small scale level, to get the kind of exposure that you need. I think this is where we're working at evolving in interfacing with the internet and broadcast and recorded media. That's one of the ways to get the word out that something new is happening, but also by finding interesting partnerships. So, I honestly think if larger Canadian companies work together on new ventures, they're going to be way more likely to see the light of day 10 years down the road. So if there's 2 premieres for a new work because CUC teams up with Vancouver or Vancouver teams up with Calgary, that's going to help just in the same way that anything. The repetition is what leads to durability or momentum.
My frustration with new music composers is bad writing for singers. I feel like a piece won't have legs if it's not well written for the singer. I've done some things that a lot of money thrown at them, fantastically big productions, and then it didn't go anywhere. And because it's not good writing. If it's not good writing for a singer in an opera, it's not. I feel like it's not gonna happen again. And I don't know about.
Although that would apply to Beethoven too.
Well, fair enough.
He'd already proven his chops elsewhere.
Yeah, he'd proven himself elsewhere. I've been asked to do some really crazy things, and I will make it work because I will do anything.
She's awesome.
But I think longevity also comes from that maybe their singer won't. I sang a piece that started on a low F at the very beginning of the piece, and later on in the piece I had to sing a high C. I don't know how many singers are going to be able to do that. And if you can't write, if you're writing for one singer, you might not find a duplicate of that one singer again. So that will definitely influence whether or not it gets performed again.
Although that's what we struggle with for most of the rap. at least the 18th and some of the 19th century rap theater was written for specific people.
Right.
Peter Pierce.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
or, the first Constanze was probably not a very ordinary singer.
I feel like those composers of that, well, they knew how to write for the voice. I feel like composers these days are not familiar with writing for voice, and that's a failing.
Name names.
No, I will not.
I think this last question is a good way to wrap this up. This is a follower on Twitter sent me this. So she said, "What I love about Regietheater is that it forces us to think critically regardless of how effective the production is. So do you think there's any piece that should be untouchable for directors?" I guess she means, should you not mess with Tosca? You should never mess with XYZ.
Well, in a way, you always mess or not. Like, I think I have, I try to keep things very simple. I think there's pieces about something and there's pieces about nothing. And the pieces about nothing are maybe just fine when you leave them alone. And the pieces about something will provide endless reward if you actually interact with them. And I think it's a different form of experience that you can have. I like Tosca, but I think it's not worth updating. And we've had that discussion before. It works really well in a church and then in a palace and then outdoors with a big angel statue.
But the truth of the matter is that the history of art is the history of things which couldn't be done until a great creator comes along and then proves us all wrong. And I'm not saying this, and so I think that is part of the answer is surely the whole thing about Regie opera is about freedom, right? It's allowing a freedom. It's an audience allowing artists freedom to try to be creative, and who will fail. A lot of them will fail, but because one production doesn't work doesn't mean that the whole concept is suspect any more than if one production of conventional opera doesn't work, do we say that the whole concept is suspect? So I think that, and it's difficult in the real world, which I don't have to deal with, which many people on the panel do, making sure that finances are acceptable and that audiences are pleased. It's easy for me to say just let 1,000 flowers bloom, but in the end I think that's what this concept has meant. It's given up for my mind as a critic and as just an audience goer a new lease on life to an art form. It's just made it so much more exciting. And as another critic, not me, said, the best theater in town is on the stage of the Four Seasons Center. And that's been true, I think, for a couple of years now. Not the best opera in town, the best theater in town. In terms of acting, in terms of design, in terms of concept. And I would think that we always want to keep the ability for that to happen as open as possible.
I used to actually think in terms of what would count as going too far or something sacrosanct and so on, but as I said at the Opera Exchange, I got radicalized about 2 years ago when I went to see the Frank Kastorf Ring in Bayreuth. And it's a total deconstruction of the Ring in some ways, and it's some of the most brilliant theatre I've seen. It doesn't make a lot of sense in all ways, but I think after that experience I've decided nothing is sacrosanct. And it's, it's either going to work or it's not going to work, and it's going to work for me or it's not going to work for me. And so I think as I said earlier, some operas, maybe the Puccini, maybe Massenet, will not lend themselves to being interpreted very readily, but otherwise, I think it's open.
What I just want to add is what I like about this new generation of directors is they don't see opera as entertainment, something that people come to after dinner and it provides some light entertainment, and you bring your business partner or your date, and then you enjoy the beautiful costumes and then you go home, you rush to your parking. No, I think opera is, like theater in general, it is a place where a society looks at itself very critically and asks tough questions about itself, and this is not going to be popular, but less entertaining and beautiful the better, really, because otherwise you're telling lies.
I mean, I have to say there's certain things I would not allow on our stage to happen in terms of violence. I think it's the most human of art forms. I want to feel and see that humanity in everything we do. I don't want it to be crude, because even if it's sometimes ugly, it's still very beautiful. And I think there's when we look at opera as let's say, research on the human condition, I think there's very few works that would be cynical about that or negative. So in a way, even though we sometimes tell difficult stories, but then if we tell them because we're passionate about us, and you want to hold a mirror.
Art and opera and everything is about, for me, is uplifting if I'm doing good, if I can make this world a little bit better, because it's very easy to make it not better, and so that's my call, I feel. And if it's through opera, that's what I have in my bone, and if it causes outrage, then that's kind of good for the art form. But for me, it's coming from I believe, a good place. So that's my litmus test. And yeah, people may say that you can't why mess with the Marriage of Figaro as it's perfect, and it is in that way, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something else.
Well, thank you, everyone. If there's anything else anyone wants to add.
Thank you, Schmopera.
Thank you, Schmopera.
Thank you.
Come and see opera.